All right, everyone. Well, good morning to some. I'm on the West Coast here in Seattle, Washington, and I know it's good afternoon for others who are on the East Coast. Welcome to the Ash Center at Harvard Kennedy School's webinar on protest and mobilization in the 2020 election, the role of philanthropy. This is a conversation that I am really excited to have. I think it's long overdue. I want to express my appreciation to the Ash Center staff, as well as Archon Fung and Miles Rapport, who was instrumental in organizing this panel and bringing all of us together to have this conversation. I also do want to let people know who are watching on YouTube to post their questions. Because we will do some Q&A at the end of the hour time. All right, so before I launch into the introductions, I think it might be helpful to say a little bit about who I am and what brought me to this interest in philanthropy. I am somebody who is a political scientist who is very much interested in the Black freedom movement, and especially around early 20th century social movement mobilizing around the fight to protect Black lives from lynching and mob violence. And so my early work focuses on the NAACP's campaign against racial violence and really a belief that the fight to protect Black life is the first civil right in this country. I didn't realize at the time when I was writing that first book, but that focus would lead me to a focus on funders. And so I had another project that really tried to examine a shift in the NAACP's agenda from a focus on racial violence to education, and again, in the early 20th century. All right, and that led me, this past year, I taught a course at the Harvard Kennedy School called Philanthropy and Social Movements, Will the Revolution Be Funded, ? And a group of really engaged students got into those issues in terms of philanthropy, power, race, equity, and social movements. And this is a final plug before I go into the introductions. They produced an exciting podcast, which I recommend everybody to listen to. And they did this in pandemic. It's called, and it can be reached at philanthropyandSocialMovements.com. All right, so I have been thinking about these issues for a while, and then obviously the events of the past 6 weeks have very much highlighted kind of the urgency to address these even more. All right, so I am joined by four esteemed panelists. First, we have David Callahan. He is founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy. He has written extensively on trends in philanthropy, as well as American culture, public policy, and business. David is author of many books, most recently of The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. Julie Fernandez is Associate Director at the Rockefeller Family Fund. Prior to RFF, she served as the Open Society Foundation's Director for Voting Rights and Democracy. She also worked as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division in the Obama administration and as Special Assistant for Domestic Policy to President Clinton. Crystal Hayling is Executive Director of the Libra Foundation, which funds organizations working to advance human rights and racial, economic, and social justice. For 6 years, Crystal lived in Singapore, where she built bridges between civil society and emerging donors in Southeast Asia to address income inequality and climate change. Gara LaMarche is president of the Democracy Alliance. Prior to joining DA, he served as senior fellow at NYU's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, and previously as president and CEO of Atlantic Philanthropies. At Atlantic, he led the foundation's efforts to embrace a social justice framework for grant making. All right, so that's the panel. It's exciting. All right, so I just want to do a quick 1 minute in terms of just to set the stage before I get into the first question of the panel. So we are now meeting here in July. There's a convergence of many factors. There's not just one reason why we are meeting, right? There is Trump, who is in office, who has a very cruel administrative agenda. We are now still, and for a while, we'll still be dealing with the effects of COVID, which has laid out so many structural inequalities that exist in our society. We also are coming not at the tail end, but still very much in the middle of Black Lives Matter protests about systemic racism in this country. And we have an upcoming election in November. So there's a lot of forces at play right now. We also know that people are literally putting their lives on the line to make this country better. The stakes are the highest they've ever been, at least in my lifetime. And I want to make that clear. And so I think it's really important that we have an honest and a challenging conversation today. All right, so for the first question, the protests after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd have brought out how deadly institutional racism can be, as well as the urgency for philanthropy to do more, much more, to confront the present moment. What do these protests reveal about the state of philanthropy? Why does philanthropy seem to have been out of step with the mass Black Lives Matter movement? And does philanthropy understand the opportunity and the crisis at hand? So I'm going to go in order of Crystal, Gara, David, and Julie.
So I would just, thanks so much for having me, and I'll just jump right in. I think that philanthropy has been very out of step for a very long time. Part of that is because we don't see the things that we can't see. By funding to try to create solutions to problems based on our own perspectives only, we create a certain set of solutions. We believe that we should fund things from the top down, and that the problems that are existing in society are due to people having a lack of resources, income, money, and a lack of knowledge. What we believe at the Libra Foundation, because we fund social justice groups and because we fund a lot of community organizing, is that we should be funding organizations that are led by and for the people most impacted by the issues. That when we do that, when we say, let's actually give people resources, because we know they actually don't have a deficit of knowledge, they have a tremendous amount of knowledge. What they lack is the power to actually enact those changes that they know need to happen. And so what we're seeing here is actually, I'm so excited to be on the panel today because many of the people like Gara and Julie have been funding for years organizations that are helping people to develop that power. That's what we do at the Libra Foundation. And we really believe that incentive of funding people to have self-determination, to actually express their policy solutions, which look different than policy solutions that come out of large think tanks, then we actually do really see that we begin to shift the power differential and be able to see real social change happening.
Yeah, for me to go next?
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, why I think what it reveals about philanthropy is that philanthropy in general is ill-equipped to respond to social movements and deal with social movements. I think that it's no understatement to say that for the most part, every significant social movement in this country, I'll confine myself to the United States for a minute, has gotten wherever it went largely without philanthropic support of any significant degree. Now, there are small exceptions to that in terms of the role, as you study, Megan, some small foundations that were civil rights funders in the 50s and 60s, like Taconic and so on, that played in a small but significant way a role. But the history of that, as you yourself have written, and I've learned a lot from it, is also compromised when you look at the role of the Garland Fund in steering the priorities of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So philanthropy at best, follows social movements. Philanthropy is not innately very accountable. I mean, and therefore doesn't often know what to do with social movements. So right now at this moment, when there is a huge demand in the streets, and you have a movement for Black lives, which is one of the most effective social movements we've had in the United States. And I recently saw that the protests of the last couple of weeks have been the largest social movement gathering of people on the streets, perhaps in American history. You haven't seen the support flow to Black-led infrastructure that ought to be commensurate with that, either over recent years or more recently. Partly it's because newer movements, I don't make the excuses for them, but I mean, they insofar as they are different in structure and less hierarchical and all of that than philanthropy is used to dealing with, they don't know quite how to react to it. And I think it's uncharacteristic of most large foundations to give up their own power for the direction of funding. So they kind of occupational hazard or disease that goes with being a large staff foundation is that you consider yourself in effect a kind of a consulting firm with money, and your grantees are more like vendors. That's not, that mentality is changing a bit, and I'm sure David, who tracks it very closely, would have more positive things to say, and I don't want to be all negative about it. But in general, there's a power dynamic at work, and the revolution, the answer to your question in the title of your class is no, the revolution will not be funded. There's an inherent disconnect between the kind of power you're seeing in the streets and the way foundations work.
Well, I would just echo everything that's already been said, and just say, going back to the history of philanthropy from the beginning in the early 20th century, it's pretty much largely been a top-down technocratic enterprise that imagines that it's all about finding the best solutions, investing in the experts, moving forward solutions, always in the guise of a kind of nonpartisan scientific expertise. And more broadly, I think philanthropy has been quite tuned out to power and how power works and who has it and how to get it. And that in the big exception to that within philanthropy, I think, has been the conservative foundations over the past 40 years, who very much understood ideology and power and the levers of influence, and over 40 years have invested in infrastructure of think tanks and litigation groups and grassroots organizations and leadership development and media and everything you need to move a power agenda. I think that Gara's points and Crystal's points about philanthropy not wanting to share power with the people who are on the front lines of problems is exactly true. So this kind of lack of understanding of power by philanthropy kind of goes in multiple directions. They don't understand the power of people and communities. They don't understand sort of power more broadly. For example, the conservative philanthropists have been very attuned to the courts and seizing control of the courts over the past 40 years. Giving to the Federalist Society is like a tithing that all foundations on the right do. I would just like to say that I do see some good news here. I think the Libra Foundation is a great example of some of the changes we're seeing in philanthropy. I think the 2016 election was a major wake-up call for a lot of mainstream and progressive foundations who realized that this very issue-specific technocratic approach to pushing their agenda wasn't really, was very vulnerable. And that a lot of foundations really pivoted and have engaged in more rapid response funding, more funding of advocacy organizations. And I think that in recent months, many have been more attuned to social movements, and hopefully, and there's a lot of sort of movement towards participatory grant making in some areas, and a more willingness to share power with the people who are closest to the problems.
So the thing that I would add, so I completely, as we say, +1, what everyone else has said about the top-down nature of philanthropy traditionally, that it's about control and about seeing grantees as vendors or consultants in the work. And that's really exaggerated in the area I'm most familiar with, which is civic engagement. But the one thing I'll add is I think part of what philanthropy has missed is the centrality of anti-Black racism as animating all of our policy and politics. And I think it's because philanthropy is a very white elite space. And despite our, rainbow panel here, for the most part, the people who drive philanthropy are not in relationship with, are not connected to, don't see themselves as part of the anti-Black racism movement, and so they don't see it as the animating principle in everything. So I think that then causes a lot of folks in philanthropy, if you don't see the root of the problem, you're not trying to change it. You're trying to change things around the edges. and not really get at the root of the problem. And I just want to echo again, I remember when the Black Lives Matter movement sparked, and I was at OSF at the time, at the Open Society Foundations. And there were so many conversations in all of philanthropy about, what is this? Who's in charge? Who would how would I even know how to relate to this? It was really like a moment of just like, I don't even know what to do, because they couldn't see this movement as something they could relate to. And what ends up happening then is that people then give to sort of big national institutions that they think they'll worry about it. They'll figure it out, but they don't. Because that's not where the solutions are. As others said, the people closest to the problem know the solutions. They just need support in being able to build the power that they need to implement those solutions and to hold people accountable along the way. So I'll stop.
That's actually a great segue into, I want to ask, I'm going to follow up, I'm going to go off script real quick to ask a more pointed question to the panel. I'm hoping maybe to get perhaps about 2 responses. One of the questions that I've had in talking to activists on the ground and our scholars and our interested individuals about this moment in particular, in terms of philanthropy, is this question about defunding the police and abolition. And where was philanthropy? And not saying that philanthropy did not at all fund, because there have been some individual donors and some funding, but not as much in terms of we see for the larger criminal justice reform. And so I guess my question here, and thinking about kind of the first question here that I raised about what do these protests reveal, and why has philanthropy seemed to be out of step with the Black Lives Matter movement? Why? I think that's just I'm curious here, and I think it touches on issues that you all have touched on, and especially Julie, this last comment around kind of the entrenchedness of anti-Blackness. But I'm wondering if 1 or 2 panelists could say a little bit more about abolition and about defunding the police. And the last thing I'll say on this point is I taught it in philanthropy and social movements. I taught abolition as policy innovation, as this is what people on the ground, especially women of color, have been talking about and organizing around for a very long time. And the question that I got from my students was like, but where's all the big initiatives around it?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if I might just take a stab at that, because I had to work these issues through for myself. I mean, at Open Society in Atlantic, we funded in criminal justice quite heavily, and we're probably the original kind of anti-mass incarceration funders. And more recently at Atlantic, we funded a lot of the early work around stop and frisk in New York. We always had folks among our fellows who were prison abolitionists and police abolitionists, but it was not the kind of dominant driver of our funding. And my own thinking about this has changed kind of rapidly. So one of the answers to your question, Megan, is that, philanthropy, like everybody else, takes a while to catch up with social movements. I've had to sort through my own feelings about defunding the police. And if you begin to look at all these things through a lens of anti-Black racism as the organizing principle of American life for 400 years, then you look at the police force differently. And I do think, though, that the arc of criminal justice funding has gone from being kind of on the kind of edge to even talk about it in terms of mass incarceration, to a movement that is now, like motherhood and apple pie in a lot of ways. It has a lot of conservative funding that's about, budgets and savings or human redemption and evangelical bearings, and centrist funding. And that is a kind of turned the mass incarceration issue into something a little more kind of safe for a lot of philanthropy. That's been the arc of that issue. I think you're beginning to see that arc in the policing world. And the valid question would be, how is it that for 20 some years a movement in philanthropy has been building about mass incarceration that somehow has, by and large, escaped the actual lived experience and demands of people in the street, and is only now beginning to catch up with that?
And I would jump in. I think that's exactly right. I think that, Angela Blackwell talks about the radical imagination. And that is what has been missing in the work that we have been funding as foundations. We want to fund small, incremental programs that have little budgets that we can understand. And that's what we want to fund organizations to do. And what lots of these organizations have done instead is they've taken those resources and they've said, how can we imagine what it would be like to actually be free? Not to just have a little bit less of a boot on our neck, but to actually be free.
Exactly.
And that is a radical thing. And that's what we're seeing now, right? So it's not to just say, when I talk to a lot of my liberal white friends, I say to them, in the last year to 2 years to 3 years, how much direct interaction have you had with a police officer? And the answer is, generally speaking, like none. And I say, and do you feel safe in your community? And they say, yeah. And I say to them, that's what Black people want. What they want is to be able to be safe in our communities without having to have daily, weekly, monthly encounters with police officers. What we'd like is to be able to have healthcare, good schools, those are the things, good jobs, clean air, clean water. And a poll just came out, I think, that says that 77% of Americans understand that the phrase defund the police means take money from here and put it over here. Like, they get that, right? Like, I've had so many debates with so many liberals who have said to me, this is a marketing nightmare. Don't use that phrasing. And apparently, like most Americans, Republicans and Democrats understand that what it means is we are spending way too much money over here, and we could take that money and better spend it over here. So I think that radical imagination is what allows us to actually identify where we want to go as a society, where we can actually achieve freedom, as opposed to how we do incremental little changes that result in people getting, 6 months time instead of 1 year of time in jail. That's what we're seeing these movements are doing. That's what is so astounding. And I think that is, as Gara pointed out, why we are seeing this protest movement that is happening right now, continuing to happen right now, as being the largest social movement in the history of this country.
Well, and it's so interesting, just to pick up on this, it's so interesting to me because part of this is like, if we're talking about within philanthropy, who is legitimate? What's a legitimate voice? Who has a legitimate point of view? Whose policy ideas are legitimate? And that, again, because philanthropy, and look, there are lots of good things and lots of progress and whatever, but a lot of it is this sort of rarefied air of people who have not just your neighbor who has no contact with the police, your white neighbor, but it's like, these are the rarest of the rare. I mean, if we're being honest, the people who work in philanthropy, the people who run philanthropy, the philanthropic boards, they're super one percenters in every way. And that makes them super, super kind of not in touch with the lived experience of most people. And so in a way, it's kind of like, I remember being in a meeting again where someone who was an African-American man this was maybe 2.5 years ago, raised this issue of defund the police. And he was laughed at by leadership as like, hey, what do you, that's just, okay, so that's ridiculous. What is the small thing we might be able to get moderate Republicans to agree to? Okay, right? Like, that's where we are. But I'll say this, part of what this is about, maybe two quick things. One thing it's about is, again, it's about power. If we take seriously wanting for people of color in states to have the power to set a policy agenda that gets them the solutions that they want for their communities, if we're serious about that, then that is a way that we kind of build the legitimacy of their voice. We have to help them build their power so their voice is legitimate, because they have the power to determine outcomes of elections, to hold people accountable, to influence the ideology on the ground, and to do it in partnership with all of their allies and people who agree with them. I mean, I find it so interesting that the establishment, including philanthropy, was so afraid of the conversation that now is so mainstreamed, and in part just because a lot of people were sitting at home looking at their phones during the pandemic. And they're like, wait a minute, I don't like this at all, right? People who never think about race because they never have to, white people, all of a sudden they're on their phone and they're like, hey, wait a minute. I think this is a problem. We underestimated white people, I think. Underestimated their capacity to say, you know what? Yeah, defund the police. I get that. Right? You shouldn't have done
All right.
that.
David, do you want to get in or can I move?
Yeah, you can move.
Okay. All right. This actually leads, I think, very nicely into what was supposed to be the second question here. And I just also want to highlight just a few resources. One, Crystal mentioned Angela Blackwell Glover's incredible work, but I highly recommend there's a podcast called A Radical Imagination, and it covers a range of topics. And one of them is about radical fiction and science fiction that I just really want to highlight that I actually listened to yesterday. The other one that is a play off of the title of my class, which is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, by a group of feminists of color, from Insight, and it's a great book, and I think for me it's kind of like the cornerstone of critical philanthropy studies. And there is a really great article, blog post from Justice Funders about called A Philanthropic Commitment to Dismantling White Supremacy and Anti-Blackness Must Include Support for Defunding the Police, that I recommend everybody read. Okay. This next question. So we know from numerous studies, most recently perhaps the Bridgespan and Echoing Green report, that there are deep structural racial inequalities that keep communities of color from building wealth and power inside of philanthropy as well as outside. What will it take for things to be different this time? How do we make sure we do not lose the momentum that we have and ensure that a durable shift has happened? And also, in what ways does philanthropy need to change to be more in step with Black and Latinx-led social movements? If each of the panelists could take about 1 to 2 minutes to answer that very complex question. And if I could start and do Julie, David, Crystal, and Gara.
Okay, I think a lot of that is kind of what we were just talking about, is I think that philanthropy needs to see itself in a culture of long-term support for building power in communities of color, in Black communities in particular, but also in other communities of color. It has to see that that's what it's doing, that it's not trying to sort of direct projects that were thought up in think tanks to sort of test this kind of small idea that they think is really fun. No, or that they've thought up that they think they know. A lot of people in philanthropy, I mean, whatever, it's our folks, but whatever. A lot of folks think because they are, particularly because they either control or have made a lot of money, then they must be super smart on everything. And so it just, you see it happening, that, you know, they know the best answer to solving this problem because they were a good software engineer. Really? So you know how to solve policing because you were a good software engineer? That can't be right. So I think there is this culture of like long-term support for groups that are building real power in communities across the country. If we could commit to that, getting away from project support, getting away from judgment, having a culture of learning and failure. Failure is a way we learn, not a way that we get cut off and tied off, whatever. That if that's our culture, we're going to go a long way towards sort of addressing this moment. And I think because what's going to happen is that there are always inflection points. There's Michael Brown. There are so many inflection points. The question is, will the groups that already exist be strong enough to take that into a policy moment? So we have to fund them all the time to be super strong and support them as thought partners. I'm not saying that the philanthropy is sort of like all we are is a cash machine. I don't think I operate like a cash machine. It's more like I'm in deep partnership and I'm humble about thinking that other people know more than I do about how to solve their problems.
I would agree with everything Julie just said, and also add, just to get a little more into the details of how money flows, which is that philanthropy needs to change its grant-making processes. It needs to give more general operating support. Right now, something like 80% of all grants made by foundations are in the form of program support, which is very restricted money given to organizations to do this or that project. And it's very much in the vein of we know the answers, you grantees are just vendors. So there's been, I think, a big push toward, a growing push towards providing more general operating support, which is particularly important for organizations engaged in movement building or public policy and advocacy, because you need to be able to sort of change on a dime and invest in infrastructure and things like communications and training and these things that foundations often don't give much value to in project support. So that's one change. Another change is more rapid response funding. I mean, this whole long grant cycle of we're going to look at your proposal for 9 months and then, we'll give you a grant that will be for 1 year. And then you have to come back at, I mean, this is one good thing about since the 2016 election is that a lot of foundations have engaged in more rapid response grant making. COVID increased that actually quite dramatically because it was such an emergency. And there's hope that this will become more of a norm. Third thing I would point to is participatory grant making, very kind of fringe idea on the margins of, hey, the idea that you give the people, the people closest to the problems, the decision-making power to allocate grants is unthinkable in a lot of philanthropy circles. But now that idea is finally getting some traction. There's some real experiments going on, and that's all a good thing. And the last thing I would say is just really being willing to take more risks and invest in the non-usual suspects, that instead of giving money to established nonprofits that have the balance sheet and, have a track record and an impressive board, you're willing to put money up to organizations that are maybe new and are flying by the seat of their pants and don't necessarily know what they're doing, but have their finger on the pulse of problems and will mature over time.
Am I next? I'll jump
Sure.
in. I think we're really starting to get to the crux of the matter here too around the funding. And I think the long-term piece here is really got to be that foundations have to enter. Julie mentioned this idea of kind of the learner's mind. And that's really a key part of what we need to be able to do here. That foundations need to enter into relationships by providing resources to people and to groups and organizations that are on the ground, closest to the issues. And then we learn together as we move down the road. Philanthropy has a bias to study instead of a bias to action. We have to actually just fund groups. Then we begin to learn together. We're actually putting together a small group of funders who've reached out to me as a result of some of the work that we've done, who've said, you know what, even if we wanted to fund some of these groups, we wouldn't know how to do so. And I'm like, that's exactly right. So let's get together. Let's, we've got some people, we can pull together a brain trust of folks and we can say, who are the groups we ought to really actually be funding? Some of the groups that we fund, some others. And let's give them money right now in this moment, because this is when they need it, and then develop a long-term relationship with those groups over time. And we can learn as funders what we have been missing, what we haven't seen, right? I think so much about one of the wins that we're seeing right now around defund the police that's happening right away is that schools are saying that they're not going to continue to take massive parts of their budgets and fund police forces in schools. When you talk to the major education funders in this country, they talk about test scores. When you talk to parents who have kids in failing schools, they talk about the fact that their kids feel unwelcome and criminalized, right? When you talk to parents who have kids who go to successful private schools, do you know what those kids, they love about those schools is that their kids feel loved when they walk in the door. Somebody cares about them, right? Those are the things parents want. Right? But we've been spending all this time over here talking about test scores, right? That's the kind of learner's mind, listening to people and growing over time together as partners. That's what we've got to see more of in philanthropy.
Well, let me plus one or plus three to all of that and say a couple other quick things. I think it's been the how of philanthropy has to continue to change, right? David's mentioned participatory grant making. I wrote in The Nation a couple of months ago about, I have a longstanding critique of philanthropy that the rest of you on the call share, but I've also been trying to think a little bit more about imagining a different kind of philanthropy. What would it look like if you actually gave the power to make grants to groups that are on the front line. So a little example of this, the David Rockefeller Fund, where I'm on the board, created or asked a bunch of returning citizens, former prisoners, to design or give them they gave them a bunch of money and asked them to design a program for grant making that the foundation has essentially delegated to them. It'd be good to see more. I mean, there's some larger structural issues we don't have the time to get into today about the way the society regulates or doesn't regulate philanthropy and what the tax system is like. But just accepting for a moment the current state of affairs, I think that, Farhad Ibrahimi, my colleague in the Democracy Alliance and the head of the Chorus Foundation, had a terrific piece after the early weeks of COVID saying, look at what these foundations are doing in providing general support and eliminating a lot of the bureaucracy around their grants. And why isn't this all the time? And maybe this is a moment in which there can be a push for that. I would say that the issue that's been raised by a couple of people about getting money to those on the front line on the ground is really important. And I think that each of us in our different ways as funders have found ways to do that. I always liked when I headed big foundations to fund various kinds of pooled funds where decisions were made and the money went to groups on the ground. I noticed in the last month or so that some organizations that I regard very highly, Equal Justice Initiative, Legal Defense Fund, and so on, have gotten an awful lot of money, both from mass donations and from corporate donations. And that's great. Those organizations are well led. They weren't always as established as they are, and they can use the money well. But there's a real problem in the society when you have a movement moment, how people find the way to get money to groups at the grassroots level who are just not captured by those movement moments, by what Hollywood celebrities or corporations do. At the DA, we started a couple of weeks ago a Tackling Anti-Blackness Fund through our New American Majority Fund, which where we already have established relationships over a number of years with Black-led groups on the ground in Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, places like that, and trying to give them money for this anti-Blackness work, which they're usually doing anyway, but they've never been able to get any funding for it. Final thing I want to say, which has not been said and is maybe the most provocative, is what really is needed is a sustained movement of pressure on foundations as power centers. So in other words, foundations, all kinds of power is on the chopping block or in the spotlight at the moment in this society. I mean, not a day goes by where I don't read about some institution whose constituents, employees or whatever, are rising up to demand more, whether it's Planned Parenthood in New York City or the Guggenheim Museum or Facebook. Even in philanthropy, 200 employees of the Open Society Foundations wrote an open letter to the management questioning the way they had organized their COVID spending. Darren Walker, my very good friend, who was on the Rikers Commission in New York City, found himself, when he took a position about smaller prisons and instead of closing them entirely, found protesters in front of the Ford Foundation having to account for himself to a town hall of Ford Foundation staffers. It's easy for me to say because I wasn't the target of it, but the fact is that's very good that that's happening. It's very good that that's happening in all kinds of institutions. And I've always wondered, I know the answer to this, why don't people who are accustomed to taking on power centers make life more difficult for progressive foundations? Progressive foundations are highly sensitive to their images. And it would be a good idea if they had to live with more demands than they have accustomed to dealing with.
One thing I'll just add to the end of that, just for a second, if you don't mind, is I think the reason why is fear, and people have to overcome that fear, obviously. It's
Safety
like the fear.
and numbers.
Yeah, no, I'm with you, Gara. Like, I'm all for it. I'm in. But it's sort of like that. It's that fear, because a lot of these organizations that we're talking about are living grant cycle to grant cycle. That's how they're staying alive. And so as long as that's true, they're going to be afraid of pissing off their funder.
Okay, great. All right, so I want to remind all the panelists, when you're not speaking, try to mute your mic. also, this was just a fascinating set of responses, and I'm really excited about this conversation thus far. One of the issues, apparently, I'm getting messages that the chat is hot, so I want to get to Q&A, but I don't want to get to Q&A without having at least one question about the election. So I'm going to ask, please, that the panelists try to answer this next question in about 1 minute, so we have time for a lot of really interesting, hopeful conversation in the Q&A. I do want to say, though, very quickly, one of the issues that is coming up, I think, in some of the questions from the audience members, as well as I think was slightly touched on in some of the responses just now, is a question about how do grassroots organizations actually access funders. And Crystal, I think you did a really great job at kind of providing a possible strategy for how that might happen. But also in terms of this question about what does it mean to be in community? What does it mean to be proximate? And what does that mean for funders who don't have that many people of color and Black people on their staff as program officers, right, in roles of power? So I just want to raise that also. But this next question here, that we know that elections, I'm a political scientist, right, are one way to create change, and a powerful one, not the only one though. November is a high stakes election, one that is critical to a fair and a robust democracy. What role, if any, should philanthropy play in the upcoming election? And I'm just gonna leave that open, and I will go to, let's get Crystal, David, Gara, and Julie. 1 minute.
It's critically important for philanthropy to play a role, because we are looking at, I wrote a piece called On the Precipice, which is basically talking about our democracy being on the precipice. If we're not engaged in helping to support organizations on the ground that are fighting the active voter suppression that is targeting primarily Black and Latino and Native communities, then we are walking away from our democracy. We are allowing what is, an encroachment and a decision to say that some people matter and some people don't. We're allowing that to take hold in our country, and that really is the basis of where we are. I know Latasha Brown has been a speaker here at the Kennedy School and a fellow, and is an incredible person. And I just remember meeting her many years ago, and she just looked at me and she said, you just need to fund more people who look and talk like me, because I am not the kind of person who sits up in the halls of foundations. And I took that to heart, and she's 100% right. And that's really what we've been doing more and more, because right now we are seeing the greatest attack against voting rights we've ever seen in this country. And if foundations are not funding organizations that are actively fighting against that, we have a huge trust deficit in this country. People have been convinced by election after election that their votes don't matter. People are standing in lines just to be able to vote and taking their lives and their health at risk to do so. This is unconscionable. And yet we have foundations who are saying, well, we're just going to fund Get Out the Vote, which basically does the same thing we've done all the time, which is 3-4 weeks before the election, we send some money out, we send some people out, they knock on doors and they get people to vote. That's not going to work right now. That's not going to work at all. The same organizations that are doing community organizing, the same organizations that have now pivoted to doing COVID relief, the same organizations that are now delivering food boxes to their neighbors, those are the organizations that are going to also be able to say, did you get your absentee ballot? Do you know what you need to do to mail it in and get it in time? Those are the organizations that are doing that. And that is not the traditional civic, it's not only the traditional civic engagement organizations, it's the grassroots organizers. And that's who we have to fund if we actually plan to have a functioning democracy in December 2020.
And I would just add that I do think that more funders are waking up to this need to get involved in the electoral arena. This is a very radioactive arena for philanthropy, or many foundations that see it as sort of the partisan world and are worried about tarnishing their brand as these sort of apolitical, nonpartisan institutions. But the 2016 election was very much a wake-up call that if you don't win, if you lose a critical election, everything you've been working on, all the billions of dollars these foundations have spent on, whether it's climate change work or healthcare, any number of things can be washed away. And so what we've seen in this election is more funders getting serious about doing the things that they can legally do to be involved in elections, such as funding work against voter suppression. And by the way, a lot of that voter suppression and voter ID laws in particular that has happened was funded by these conservative foundations who understand what's at stake in the vote, and have had a very long-term strategy to suppress the vote. And tens of millions of dollars of tax-deductible charitable gifts have gone to voter suppression. And so the foundations on the other side need to fight back.
Sorry, two quick things. I would say that this conversation, this question, which was characterized as a little separate from the first two, is actually the same question, because the same question is, if you are funding communities of color, if you are funding people in communities who are taking responsibility for their own lives, funding Black and Brown and Asian and Native people, and you're doing that consistently and taking your direction from them and giving the kind of general support that they can use to build the capacity they need year in, year out, then you're doing what you need to do. Most foundations can't really do, but that's also often a function of. So I'm saying that it's really, I would give the same answer to the question. On top of that, I would echo, what David said and what others have said, what Crystal said. The very structures that we've looked very carefully, a lot of us in the last couple of years, and seen that how vulnerable the structures of democracy are. And there's been a long-standing campaign to suppress and manipulate the vote. I personally, in my own opinion, feel that a fair election is one that the right side would win. I fear that we won't have a fair election, and that there are any number of ways, from suppression of the vote to intimidation to people trying to handle the new means of voting by mail and so on, to what happens in the count, what happens after the count, all of those things which are 95% fundable by C3 philanthropy need to be heavily invested in now, because they're about the structures of democracy.
What I would just add to all of this, I completely agree with everything that has been said here. Number one, to +1 on David, the right has had a framework that they have promoted to persuade people that work to increase civic engagement is partisan, that expanding the electorate is partisan, and philanthropy has bought that. Ooh, we can't do elections, that's partisan. It's not partisan to try and get more Black people to vote. It is not partisan to try and get more Latinx people to vote. It is not partisan to have fair rules, but we've sort of internalized that it kind of is, or it's kind of scary, and that's why we want to stay away from it. We have got to debunk that at every opportunity, to say what you said, David, about what has been funded on the other side, but also to say, do we believe in democracy or not? Do we really actually believe in representative democracy? And if so, what are we afraid of to say that out loud? So second thing I want to say is that the work, I want to +1 on this idea, these are the same groups, it's the same work, but that also the work doesn't stop in November. What I really hope is that we wake up on November the 4th and say, so what's our double down plan now? How are we turning whatever happens into a progress forward? And it's not just about Trump. It's not just about the national election. There are elections all the way down the ballot. There are, the county prosecutor or the parish prosecutor, whatever he's called in New Orleans Parish, is up for election. That's an election. There are elections everywhere that really matter to people. But let's not think of this as a moment. Let's think of it as sort of the end of our journey. We need to wake up and support groups in their fight to win real stuff, starting in January, when the legislative sessions will start. No rest for the weary, man. They're going to wake up in January and have a 4-month legislative session to say, how do I deal with this budget business? How do I deal with the healthcare crisis? How are we dealing in our communities, protecting ourselves now? So let's not forget that.
And I want to jump in just to add on to Julie's point that I think is so critically important, is also we have seen an enlivening of our democratic process by new people running for office. Where do a lot of those new people come from? They come from these community organizations, right? They started out as high school organizers, then they come into these groups and they realize that they actually have the power to shape what their communities look like, right? So we're not going to have actual representative democracy if we don't actually encourage people to also run for office. And that's where a lot of these really new, exciting folks who are running are coming from. So that's
great. Okay. So I want to get to some of the audience questions here. I know we have 9 minutes left. Crystal's going to have to roll off in about 4, but I'm going to go for an extra 5 minutes if that's okay for the rest of the panelists, just to make sure we get to a few. So what I'm going to do for this next set is I'm going to raise 3 questions actually from the audience. Then I'm going to go to Crystal first, Crystal, Gara, Julie, and then David, and answer whichever one you would like to answer. And then that will be it. And then I will ask one more question. I do also want to amplify the work of Latasha Brown and Black Voters Matters Fund in terms of where we are right now and doing incredible organizing mobilization in the South. And it's really transformed even the way that I think as a Black political scientist about organizing. Okay, all right. So we have a question. Hey, Rob Reish over there at Stanford. The question here is, big philanthropists are among the most unaccountable actors in society. Why are they so risk averse when it comes to engaging and funding social movements? And then Archon Fung, he wants to kind of add on 2 finger onto Rob's question. And he adds here, whom do panelists think foundation presidents and staff are accountable or at least responsive to? So that's kind of like one set of 2 questions. And then another question here, is that philanthropy is in many ways a creature of capitalism, and through grant making can reproduce many of the same hierarchies that capitalism produces. We know that from listening to activists in this moment, that one of the central analysis to come out from the rage felt by so many is that it's not just about police, it's not just about racism, but it's also about the system of racial capitalism. And if we take the concerns of community members seriously, how do grant makers think about doing insurgent work inside of philanthropic institutions to address racism and capitalism?
Well, I think the insurgent work is by both the pressure that Julie and Gara talked about, external pressure. I think it's also about really pushing these organizations to hire people of color into positions of authority. That's really critically important. I think we actually have a lot of public policy work that we've got to do about the whole industry of philanthropy. Donor advised funds that have no requirement that they have a minimum requirement of what they give away. That's ridiculous. The whole concept that endowments should be for forever and that the money should definitely be there, that we've got to begin to question some of these things, that this is not, our foundation doubled our grant making this year. And that was just, it's just a small step, but it's an important one because it does begin to just say, what's the money for? And that's really the question that we want to have. And what's the best way for us to begin to use that? So I think that we do have a lot of very important structural questions that need to have some kind of conversation about a massive change around the industry of philanthropy, because right now, quite honestly, it's not accountable to anyone. And there are many of us who are working on the inside who are trying to change that. But right now, donors are actually being encouraged to think that they can make the best decisions without having any oversight, without having any independent people on their boards of directors. And that's really got to change.
Sorry. The person hours that are wasted and people unmuting themselves on these calls could add up to a lot of good for society. So I guess I'm next here. Let me talk about boards for a minute, because foundation presidents are, in a literal sense, or at least they certainly believe to be, accountable to boards of directors. And in the years that I was heading social movements, healthcare reform, whatever, and I would have a lot of my colleague foundation presidents say, I wish that I could do that, but my board is, not, wouldn't be supportive. I have to walk a fine line. And, I don't know, it's hard to judge, but the board I had at Atlantic was a relatively establishment board, almost all white, university presidents, hedge fund people and so on. It wasn't some kind of radical board. It didn't have, for the most part, people from the field on it, as eventually the Open Society Board came to have. And by the way, having people from the field on your board is another thing entirely, because then those people are generally isolated within a structure of more establishment types, and often they're getting grants from the foundation, and however wonderful they may be, their voices are somewhat muted. So that's not a panacea itself. But I would say that, you can, my own view is that it's a failure of leadership more on the part of the CEOs. I mean, yes, boards need to change. There's no question about that. But in my own direct experience, you can lead boards to different places if you're willing to get out in front of them. And a lot of people aren't. They're very risk averse. What's the worst thing can happen in a foundation? You could lose your job. In fact, it actually happened to me at Atlantic because I ran afoul of my own donor eventually. So, maybe the lesson a lot of people took is don't try that at home. But I think that you have to live with yourself at the end of the day, and you need to push the envelope as much as you possibly can. I have one other thing to say about the risk aversion, but I can't remember what it was. So I'll go on to David or Julie, whoever's next.
Okay, maybe I'll take it. I didn't know if it was my turn. I don't have that much to add, actually, because I was going to say exactly what you just said, Gara, is that I was going to take on the question of like risk averse. And I do think that my own experience is that I've never been the CEO or the executive director of a foundation, but having worked in philanthropy, is that you just have to have the, whatever it is, to just say what's true and help educate and lead your board to a place where you're actually telling them what you think is right. I think a lot of foundation leadership, they have staffer syndrome, what I call staffer syndrome. They think of themselves as staffing their board. And so they become more conservative than the board. And they're always trying to figure out, like, what does my board want me to do? What does my board want me to do? It's like, no, don't think that way. Think about what you think is right and then sell it. But they don't do it. And I just think they're just maybe not the right people. And you should be proud for what happened to you at Atlantic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I guess I'd just like to introduce a cautionary note along the lines of be careful what you wish for to activist philanthropy and more funding. And we've all been sitting around saying, oh, philanthropy needs to do this. It needs to be more involved in elections and needs to invest more in social movements. And billionaires need to give away more money and foundations need to raise their payout. And again and again and again, we come up with a long list. It's easy to do of the things the ways philanthropy might engage in civic life and economic life. And it's important to remember that this is concentrated wealth. Increasingly, philanthropy is is being run by living billionaire donors. I mean, 20 years ago, it was mainly legacy foundations piloted by professional staff. More and more foundations are now working, as basically instruments of billionaire donors. And I think that that's a scary development in terms of who has power in our democracy. If you fast forward or go back 60 years in American life, before we have the sort of rise of a lot of philanthropy and this whole, vast infrastructure of nonprofit organizations, democracy was really more about mass-based civic organizations. And I think we've had very much this sort of professionalization of social change with this large social sector. And in part, what's happened is philanthropy investing in the social movement, in social movements, professionalizing them, and those social movements become less activist over time. And, there's a long history of social movements being kind of co-opted and made more conservative by philanthropy. So be careful what we wish for, is I guess what I would take away.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to do, again, 2 questions, 1-minute responses. That was fantastic. I think in terms of some of the responses to that last question really highlighted the importance of having courage. Going to the board. I love, Julie, where you were like, figure out what you want to sell and sell it, right? Gara, that's what you've done. I actually, there is a really great webinar, I think it's the Center for Effective Philanthropy, in which Crystal discussed how she went to the board and got them to agree to doubling, right, the amount of payout from the Libra Foundation, even in COVID. And that really, in terms of, I played this clip for my students just so they could get a sense of the type of courage and leadership that is necessary to actually change things. All right, so just one question here: has focused on impact and philanthropy over the last 20 years made movement funding harder? I.e., because it skews focus towards measurable and attributable outcomes, and that it's harder regarding in terms of long-term change. And then another question here that has come up in various ways through the audience questions, which is about the conservative legal movement and conservative funders. Wealthy conservatives have invested in their civic and political interest for 50+ years. What do we do today? Perhaps I'm assuming, what do we as in progressives do today to build the foundation of a similarly effective, sustained, influencing campaign? So does anybody want to jump in here?
I'll jump in quickly, just on the first one, because I had a thought when you mentioned this whole idea about measurement and long-term change. I think the problem is not measurement. Every organizing group that I know, and we actually work with, we've put together a learning community of 13 different base building groups around the country that we're in partnership with. And the first question we ask them is, what do you want to learn? And they're like, here are the 7 things I want to know about my program. I want to know if this is effective. I want to know if this tactic works. I want to know about this strategy. I want to know about this message. They have a lot they want to learn. And so our tactic is, okay, you want to learn that? Let's pair you with a social scientist, and let's pair you with, and we'll fund the things you need to drive a research agenda that answers your questions. So I'm all about learning. I think what's happened in the field is that we started this push towards measurement has meant that we are both measuring things that are easy to measure, because we want to be able to say it's 3, not 4, it's 0.4, it's 0.7 or whatever. We want a number, and not measuring things that are complex. And we're also using measurement as punishment. Like all these foundations have, like, we have this, like, our evaluation person. It's really about figuring out, trying to find a metric that they can use in order to tie people off. So I kind of feel like for me, so much of this is about deep relationship. Just pick a set of states, pick a set of groups, get into relationship with them, and then talk about how can we learn? How can we learn long term? What does it look like? You know, Hari Han at Hopkins at the Agora Center, she's a partner of ours in this work that we have. And part of what she's doing is she is leading on how do you measure power? So we're like, yeah, our groups really want to know that. And so we're engaged with her and her team. Liz McKenna is helping a lot of our groups. We have a lot of this, but we're in deep relationship, and failure's okay. And measurement is what we need so we can get better.
If I might combine the 2 questions, I think, I've spent a lot of time kind of looking at conservative philanthropy, and I actually have had over the years pretty good relationships with the leaders in conservative philanthropy. We don't agree on anything policy-wise. We often agree on the way philanthropy ought to operate. And I've had a lot of conversations, public conversations and otherwise, with Jim Pearson, who was the head of the Olin Foundation for many years. It spent itself down. And I asked him once in a public forum, I knew the answer, but I said, how did you, assess the impact? How did you evaluate the work that you did? And he looked at me like strangely and said, well, I don't know. We looked at the newspaper, turned on the television, said they weren't highly sophisticated in the way that most progressive foundations would be about that. And I'm not suggesting, I entirely embrace the ethos around assessment that Julie just laid out. But I think that in their heyday, the conservative foundations had an enormous amount of trust in the groups that they were funding, and ongoing regular trustful relationships, and embodied the best practices in a lot of ways that I think philanthropy ought to have, although on behalf of nefarious ends. Now, I want to say though that conservative philanthropy isn't what it used to be. I mean, I think there was a heyday. I don't really think the energy and the innovation and so on is with conservative philanthropy anymore. I think it's run out of steam in a lot of ways. And, you know, progressive philanthropy has been trying to catch up. I think the disease that we have and the boards have is a kind of a short-termism, you know, is wanting to get results and then move on. I mean, I found when I got to Atlantic that they were so concerned with impact that they wanted to make sure their goals were highly tangible in terms of this policy change by this year. And, you know, if it wasn't moving, you know, you'd pull the funding and go on. And we tried to change that because it seems to me that the best investment you can make is not so much in a specific policy change, but in the strengths of movements that now or 5 years from now or 10 years from now will have the capacity to fight whatever policy change is needed.
I would agree with that. One conservative foundation president once described to me being the kind of philanthropy they practiced at the Bradley Foundation as being like making wine. You know, you wait for 20 years. And this is the thing about building infrastructure and changing power. It takes a long time, and there's no clear metrics near term that you can rely on often in making your investments.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to a final closing question here. And David, that was actually an excellent segue. So history teaches us that freedom is a process. That is definitely the story of the Black freedom movement in this country. So the struggle will continue long after the summer and after this year. Moving forwards, my question for our panelists, how can philanthropy do a better job at holding itself accountable? This can be perhaps one way that you are going to change in terms of what you do, or philanthropy as a sector. How can it do a better job at holding itself accountable to communities of color specifically? And if I could get, let's do David, Gara, and Julie.
Well, the most important thing legacy foundations can do is diversify their boards. Gara's talked about how the foundation boards often tend to be conservative or not ideologically conservative necessarily, but sort of temperamentally very white. I mean, there's a lot of research just showing how white board leadership is in the foundation world. And so I think having that one step would be very important just right there.
I don't know. I guess I would say that there needs to be some version in all American institutions of kind of truth and accountability for the past, right? We're seeing that in certain ways recently, kind of arising mostly from the streets, monuments, things like that. And there's a lot of worry that, of course, you know, the movement moment at least ebbs if it doesn't pass. And I think that you know, when that moment passes, some institutions will be different. Some leaders will be gone. Some policies will be changed. But I think if you're really serious about the work, even, you know, progressive foundations that have been or have struggled and tried to do the right thing need to find some way of honestly assessing themselves and their practices and then committing to listening to it. And I'm fiddling around with what that might look like, you know, for the Democracy Alliance. A version of this has taken place in many institutions around Me Too issues, where a lot of people did audits and, you know, learned about their culture. And I think, I mean, there's a whole DEI industry, of course, and almost every foundation is going through some form of that. But I mean, in a deeper way that's more personally accountable and institutionally accountable. And I haven't really thought a lot about what that looks like. And maybe look different for different institutions, but I think that it's a moment where we need to press for that, or it needs to be pressed for.
Yeah, I don't have a better answer at all. Only thing I'll do is just flag one thing that David said is the rise of hedge fund and .com philanthropy, which is it's a whole separate animal around lack of accountability. because often it's a person with a couple of folks that work for that person who advise them on how they're spending their huge amounts of money every year to impact public policy. I don't know how you make that accountable.
Ooh, y'all have raised so many important issues here. So I really want to thank all of the audience members. There was over 4 pages of questions that I had in my shared Google document. I am so sorry that I was not able to get to the vast majority of them. We are deeply grateful for your engagement in these issues, and they have only highlighted that lots of people care about these issues. I really want to thank my esteemed panelists for taking time out of their incredibly busy schedules to spend time here in conversation about these questions. And to the Ash Center and the Harvard Kennedy School, thank you for making space to have this conversation. With that, it's done. This will be posted. Come back to it. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
Bye.